Are you going to hurt me? Sophia whispered as he moved closer, his blue eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Alexander Stone, the ruthless 42-year-old CEO who controlled the largest tech empire on the East Coast, stopped in his tracks at the vulnerability in her voice. What had started as a simple job interview had turned into something neither of them had planned. Stay till the end and rate this story. Subscribe for more romances that will make you sigh. Have you ever felt like your past could destroy your future in a single moment? What would you have done in Sophia's place? Alexander looked at the 24-year-old woman standing before him, trembling. Sophia Carter had golden brown hair that fell in soft waves over her shoulders and a fierce determination in her gaze that contrasted with her apparent fragility. She had arrived at his office that morning with an impeccable resume and a hidden desperation that he immediately recognized. His cobalt blue eyes reflected a history of struggle Alexander had seen before in the mirror during his own darkest days. He wore a simple grey suit, probably the only one he owned, perfectly pressed but with small signs of wear on the cuffs that spoke of years of careful use. His black shoes were impeccably polished, but he noticed the heels were slightly scuffed, evidence of long walks rather than taxis. "I'm not going to hurt you, Sophia," Alexander murmured, his husky voice betraying an emotion he'd kept buried for years. "But I need to know why you're really here." The office on the 45th floor of the glass skyscraper was filled with a tense silence. The lights of New York flickered beyond the windows as Sophia struggled with the words she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in front of the mirror. Her hands trembled as she crumpled the resume she'd spent her last few dollars printing on quality paper. "I need this job," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "You have no idea how much I need it." Alexander had interviewed hundreds of candidates over the years. He had seen greed, ambition, feigned desperation, and calculated manipulation. But he had never seen this kind of raw, desperate honesty. He took a step closer, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume, a mix of jasmine and something deeper that made him clench his fists. Over the past 10 years, he'd built an empire based on coldness and control. Women flitted in and out of his life without a trace, models seeking status, executives seeking connections, heiresses seeking fun. But something in Sophia's eyes told him she would be different, that she could be dangerous to the wall he'd built around his heart. "How much?" he asked, his grey gaze penetrating hers as if he could read her soul. Sophia took a deep breath, and Alexander noticed her hands ball into fists to control the trembling. The words she'd sworn never to say out loud crowded in her throat, threatening to shatter the composure she'd maintained during months of job hunting. "My little sister has cancer." The words came out as a broken whisper. "The treatments cost $500,000 a year. I lost my last job because I missed so much time taking care of her. No company wants to hire me when they see my work history full of absences." Alexander felt something move in his chest, a crack in the armor he had carefully built. His own sister, Isabella, had died of leukemia when he was 30, and the pain still visited him on the darkest nights. He remembered hospital waiting rooms, the smell of disinfectant, the helplessness of having all the money in the world and not being able to buy more time. "How old is he?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost fatherly. 16, Emmy. That's all I have left in this world," Sophia replied, and for the first time since he'd walked in, Alexander saw tears threatening to fall from her eyes. "Our parents died in an accident when she was 8. I've been her guardian ever since." The vulnerability in her confession hit Alexander like a punch to the solar plexus. He turned toward the window, trying to regain the composure that had made him one of the most feared men on Wall Street. The Manhattan spread out before him suddenly looked different, less like a kingdom he had conquered, and more like a backdrop for the real human drama unfolding in his office. "The personal assistant position requires full availability," she said without turning around, her voice returning to the professional tone she used as armor. "Last-minute trips, business dinners that extend into the wee hours, completely unpredictable schedules." Some days I start at 5 in the morning, others I finish at midnight. I can do that, Sophia replied quickly, with a firmness that surprised him. Emmy's in remission now. The doctors say she's responding well to her current treatment. I need financial stability to keep her health insurance and be able to afford a decent apartment near the hospital. Alexander turned slowly, studying her face for any sign of falsehood. The golden light of the sunset framed his tall, athletic silhouette, highlighting the strong jaw covered by a shadow of carefully maintained beard, and the broad shoulders that had made more than one woman in New York sigh. But in his grey eyes, there was something Sophia hadn't expected to see, deep understanding, and something that looked dangerously like tenderness. There was something about Sophia's posture, the way she held her chin high despite the desperation in her eyes, that reminded him of himself at 28, when he had started his company with nothing but determination and a desperate need to prove he could turn pain into power. The salary is $150,000 a year, plus performance bonuses that can reach another $50,000, he said brusquely, returning to his desk. Full medical insurance for you and one dependent, dental coverage, paid vacation, and an emergency medical fund that covers expenses not covered by insurance. Sophia felt her knees weaken. It was more than double what she had hoped to earn anywhere, more than she had dreamed possible. Yes, that's more than enough, he stammered, gripping the back of the chair to stay upright. But why? You haven't even seen my work. You haven't checked my references. Alexander walked to her mahogany desk, but stopped halfway. The proximity between them had become electric, charged with a tension neither of them could ignore. He could see the small golden freckles dotting her nose, the way her breathing had quickened, the pulse visibly beating in her neck. "Because I know determination when I see it," he said, extending his hand toward her in a gesture that felt more personal than professional. "And because something tells me you're going to surprise me. Something tells me you're going to change my life as much as I hope to change yours." When Sophia took his hand, Alexander felt an electric shock run down his arm and settle directly into his chest. Her skin was soft, but her grip was firm, and for a moment that lasted an eternity, their eyes met in a silence that spoke of unspoken promises and dangerous possibilities. "Thank you," Sophia whispered, her voice filled with more than professional gratitude. "You don't know what this means to me." "I think I know better than you know," Alexander replied, still holding her hand. "You start on Monday, 3 weeks later. The third quarter numbers are in, Mr. Stone," Sophia said, walking into the office with a tray of coffee and a stack of documents neatly organized in color-coded folders. In 3 weeks, she had proven herself more efficient than any assistant Alexander had had in his 15-year career. She arrived at 7 in the morning, an hour before him, and stayed until he left, regardless of the time. She had memorized his preferences with a precision bordering on telepathic. Black coffee, no sugar, in the blue ceramic mug that had belonged to her father. Meetings scheduled 15 minutes apart to allow for smooth transitions. Personal calls transferred directly to voicemail, unless they were medical emergencies related to Emmy. But what disturbed him most wasn't her professional efficiency. It was the way her presence had begun to fill spaces he didn't even know were empty. The sound of her heels in the hallway had replaced coffee as his indicator that the day had officially begun. Her occasional laugh during calls with Emmy had brought a warmth to the office he'd never experienced before. "Thank you," she murmured, taking the coffee cup. Their fingers brushed briefly as she passed him the cup, and Alexander noticed that she no longer flinched at these accidental contacts. In fact, she seemed to subtly seek them out, allowing her hands to meet when she passed him documents, brushing his shoulder when he leaned over to show her something on his computer screen. Sophia had changed over the past few weeks too. The desperation in her eyes had been replaced by a growing confidence that made her walk more erect and smile more often. She had bought new clothes, outfits that fit her perfectly, and flattered her slim yet curvaceous figure. Her hair shone with new vitality, and Alexander found himself looking forward to her arrival each morning like a teenager waiting to see his crush in the school hallway. "How is Emmy?" he asked, surprising himself. He rarely inquired about his employees' personal lives, but with Sophia, he'd broken that rule from day one. A genuine smile lit Sophia's face, completely transforming her from the efficient professional into the loving sister she truly was. "Better every day. Yesterday was her first day back at school in 6 months," she replied, and Alexander could hear the contained excitement in her voice. "She says she wants to be a pediatric oncologist to help other children like her. She's talking about studying medicine, specializing, changing the world." Alexander felt something, a warm expand in his chest. He had been anonymously sending flowers and books to the hospital where Emmy was receiving treatment, and he had arranged for the city's top pediatric oncologist to review her case without Sophia's knowledge. Seeing hope return to Sophia's eyes was better than any financial gain he had achieved. "She's a strong girl, like her sister," he said, his eyes meeting hers in a gaze that lasted longer than was professionally appropriate. The moment stretched between them, charged with an intimacy neither of them had planned, but that they had both felt growing day by day. Sophia was the first to look away, a light blush coloring her cheeks in a way that made Alexander want to reach out and trace the color with his fingers. "I have to organize your schedule for next week," he murmured, heading for the door with steps that seemed less confident than his usual efficiency. "Sophia," Alexander called, and when she turned, he found himself searching for words he hadn't planned to say, words that might change the careful dynamic they'd built. "You've done an exceptional job, beyond exceptional. I wanted you to know that." The smile she gave him struck him like a bolt of lightning, straight to the heart. It was pure, genuine, without the layers of calculation or manipulation he was used to seeing in the women in his social circle. "Thank you, Alexander. That means a lot to me. More than you can imagine." It was the first time she'd called him by his name instead of Mr. Stone, and the sound of her voice saying it sent an electric shock straight down his spinal cord. The way her lips moved around the syllables, the casual intimacy of the gesture, made him imagine what his name would sound like on her lips under very different circumstances. A week later, the snowstorm had started at noon as a light rain, but by 6 in the evening it had turned into a full-blown storm that had virtually paralyzed the entire city. Alexander looked out his office window, watching the flakes fall like a thick white veil over Manhattan, transforming the city into something magical and dangerous. "All flights have been cancelled," Sophia announced, hanging up the phone after a long and seemingly frustrating conversation. "Your appointment with the investors in Boston will have to be postponed until tomorrow. I've also cancelled your dinner with the Japanese clients and rescheduled the conference call with London for tomorrow afternoon." Alexander nodded, but his attention was divided between the storm reports and the growing concern he felt at the almost completely empty building. Most of the employees had left early to avoid being trapped, but Sophia had insisted on staying to handle cancellations and rescheduling. "And how are you going to get home?" he asked, noticing for the first time that visibility outside was practically zero. "I'll take the subway." "It always runs, even in the snow," Sophia replied, but Alexander could detect a note of uncertainty in her voice that wasn't normally there. Alexander watched her as she packed her things into the black leather bag she had bought the week before. She was wearing a navy coat that brought out her eyes and a grey wool scarf that gave her a youthful, vulnerable air. The thought of her traveling alone on the subway in this storm, walking through slippery, poorly lit streets, unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain, and that went far beyond the normal concern a boss feels for his employee. "My driver is taking me. I'll give you a lift," he said, trying to sound casual as he put on his black wool coat. "There's no need, really. I don't want to bother you." "It's not a suggestion, Sophia," he interrupted, using the authoritative tone he reserved for boardrooms, but softened by something that sounded dangerously like territorial protection. "And it's not a bother. Brooklyn's on the way." During the silent drive, Alexander found himself staring at her profile in the reflection of the fogged-up window. Sophia lived in Brooklyn, in a small Park Slope apartment she shared with Emmy. She'd mentioned it was a pre-war building, with noisy radiators and temperamental pipes, but it had character and was close to the best hospitals. It was a completely different world from his own, full of real worries and unconditional love, and Alexander found himself feeling genuinely curious about this life that seemed so authentic compared to his penthouse and five-star restaurant existence. "Stop here," Sophia said, as they reached a modest street lined with red brick buildings with wrought iron staircases and bare trees that looked spectacular covered in snow. "This isn't safe," Alexander observed, noting the poor lighting, the few pedestrians fighting the wind, and the thick layer of snow that made the sidewalks treacherous. "I've lived here my whole life. I'm fine," Sophia replied, but her voice didn't sound as convincing as her words. When Sophia opened the car door, a gust of icy wind and snow hit her with such force that it nearly knocked her off her feet, sending her stumbling dangerously in her heels on the slippery sidewalk. Alexander immediately jumped out of the car without a second thought and took her arm, steadying her against his body in a move that was pure protective instinct. For a moment, she was completely pressed against him, her face inches from his, their bodies pressed together by the need to maintain balance and protect themselves from the wind. Alexander could feel her warm breath against his neck, the shivering of her body. He couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the proximity, and the world stopped around them. Snow fell upon them like confetti at a private celebration, creating a moment of perfect intimacy amid the urban storm. "Alexander," Sophia whispered, and there was something different in her voice. Something vulnerable and needy that made all the self-control he had built up over the years begin to crumble brick by brick. "Let me come up with you," he said, his voice husky with a need he hadn't felt in years, hadn't allowed himself to feel. "To make sure you get there safely." "To make sure you're safe," Sophia nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his, and together they ran toward the entrance of the building, their bodies involuntarily pressed together as they fought against the wind that seemed determined to separate them. The apartment was small but cozy, with photographs of Emmy everywhere, documenting her growth from a smiling little girl to the spunky teenager she was now. There was a warmth that contrasted sharply with the minimalist coldness of Alexander's penthouse. The walls were painted a soft yellow. There were hand-knitted throws on the second-hand sofa that spoke of quiet nights watching movies, and a small kitchen that smelled of spices and real home. "Where's Emmy?" Alexander asked, noticing the unusual silence and the absence of the teenage energy he had expected. "She's staying over at her best friend Sarah's house. It's the first time in months she's had the energy for a sleepover," Sophia replied, removing her damp coat with movements that seemed slower and more deliberate than usual. The realization that they were completely alone, without Emmy's protective presence as a buffer, hit them both at the same time with an intensity that was almost physical. Alexander found himself studying every detail of the apartment, the medical bills neatly organized on the kitchen table next to a half-finished cup of tea, Emmy's books stacked next to her medications, a photograph of the two sisters embracing on what seemed like a happier day in Central Park before cancer entered their lives. "Do you want coffee?" Sophia asked, nervous for the first time since he'd met her, her hands playing with the hem of her blouse. "Please." As she moved around the small kitchen, Alexander felt like a giant in a doll's world, but not in a bad way. Everything was so different from his life of penthouses and five-star restaurants, but there was something authentic here that his world had long since lost. Here was real life, real struggles, real love that had no price or conditions. "Here you go," Sophia said, holding out a steaming cup of coffee that smelled of cinnamon and promises. Their hands brushed as they reached for the cup, and this time neither of them moved away. The contact extended longer than necessary, and Alexander could see the small scars on Sophia's hands, marks from years of working low-paying jobs to support her sister, evidence of a strength that went far beyond the physical. He felt a deep admiration for this woman who had sacrificed so much for love, who had turned pain into purpose. "Sophia," he began, but she interrupted him. "I know what you're thinking," she said, looking away toward the window where the snow was still falling. That this is pathetic. A 24-year-old girl living like she's the mother of a teenager. In an apartment she can barely keep warm in the winter. Worrying about medical bills that never end? No, Alexander interrupted firmly, taking her chin in his hand with a gentleness that contrasted with the firmness of his voice, forcing her to look at him. I'm thinking you're the bravest woman I've ever met. I'm thinking you have more strength in your pinky finger than most people have in their entire bodies. Sophia's eyes filled with unshed tears, and Alexander felt something inside him finally break, a wall he had held up for decades, finally giving way to this extraordinary woman. I'm thinking, he continued, moving closer, that I've spent 40 years building an empire, but until I met you, I didn't know what it was like to really have something worth protecting. Without thinking, he closed the distance between them, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, as if asking permission to cross a line that would change everything between them forever. Did this intense connection between Alexander and Sophia touch your heart? Like if you want to know what happens when Emmy discovers his secret. When Sophia kissed him back, wrapping her arms around him as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Alexander deepened the contact with a passion that surprised even him. She tasted of coffee and unfulfilled promises, of hope and vulnerability, and for the first time in years he felt completely alive, completely present in a moment that had nothing to do with business or power. "Alexander," she murmured against his lips, her voice filled with a need that matched his own, but also an uncertainty he immediately recognized. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his hands caressing her face with a tenderness she didn't know she possessed. "Tell me to stop, and I'll do it right now." But Sophia didn't tell him to stop. Instead, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him with an intensity that spoke of years of loneliness, of sacrifice, of a woman finally allowing herself to feel something for herself after so much time caring for others. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing heavily, their foreheads pressed together, their worlds completely altered. The snow continued to fall outside the window, creating a cocoon of intimacy around them that felt like being inside a magical snow globe. "What are we doing?" Sophia asked, her voice barely a whisper, filled with equal parts wonder and fear. "I don't know," Alexander admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "But I don't want it to stop. For the first time in years, I don't want something to stop." She looked into his eyes, and he saw in them the same confusion, the same desire, the same feeling of being on the verge of something that could change everything, that could be wonderful or devastating or both. "Me neither," he whispered, and in those two words there was a surrender that was more intimate than any caress. And in that moment, as the storm raged outside, and they found themselves sheltered in that small apartment filled with love and struggle, they both knew that their lives had just changed forever, that they had crossed a line from which there would be no turning back. 2 weeks later. Have you ever felt like the world could change in a single phone call? Like all the happiness you've built could crumble in 30 seconds? Sophia was organizing documents for the afternoon meeting with the Japanese investors, softly humming a song Emmy had taught her when her phone vibrated against the glass desk. The name Mount Sinai Hospital appeared on the screen, and her heart stopped for a full second before she answered with hands that were already beginning to shake. "Sophia Carter, this is Dr. Martinez from the Pediatric Oncology Department. Emmy has had a severe relapse. Her blood work numbers have dropped dramatically. We need you to come in immediately." The words hit Sophia like a hammer to the chest, stealing her breath and making her feel as if the floor had opened up beneath her feet. Neatly organized papers scattered across the floor as she clutched the desk to stay upright, the world becoming blurry and distant. When did the symptoms start?" she managed to ask, her voice sounding strange and distant even to herself. "Early this morning. High fever, extreme fatigue, nosebleeds. She's stable now, but we need to start treatment immediately." "Sophia, what's wrong?" Alexander's voice brought her back to reality, like a lifeline in the midst of an ocean of panic. He stood in the doorway of her office, his expression changing immediately upon seeing her condition, going from professional concentration to the deepest concern in seconds. Emmy, the hospital, relapse. I have to go now, she stammered, desperately searching for her purse, with hands that shook so much she couldn't grip anything properly. Alexander didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations or details. Within seconds, he was at her side, gently taking her hands to stop the shaking, his presence solid and calming amid the emotional chaos that threatened to consume her. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice firm but infinitely gentle. "Focus on my voice. We're going to get to the hospital. My driver will take us. Everything's going to be okay." During the drive, which felt both endless and too short, Sophia couldn't stop thinking about her last conversation with Emmy the night before. Her sister had been so excited, telling her about the new boy in her chemistry class, so full of plans for the upcoming spring dance. How could this be happening again? How could the universe be so cruel? "It's going to be okay," Alexander said, taking her hand and interlacing their fingers with a firmness that felt like an anchor. His touch was warm, solid, like a promise that she wouldn't face this alone. "You don't know," Sophia replied, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "Last year we thought we'd lost her twice. Once her heart stopped for 3 minutes. 3 minutes, Alexander. The doctors said if she relapsed again, her options would be significantly limited." She couldn't finish the sentence because the reality of losing Emmy, of being completely alone in the world, was too devastating to put into words. Alexander gripped her hand tighter, his own heart breaking at the pure pain in her eyes. "Then we'll make sure you get the best treatment possible. Whatever it takes. Money's no object, Sophia. I'll call the best oncologist on the East Coast, the best in the world if necessary." When they arrived at the hospital, the familiar smell of disinfectant and fluorescent lighting hit Sophia like a slap of painful memories. Emmy was in room 412, pale as the snow still falling outside, but conscious and trying to smile when she saw her older sister. "Hey, big sister," Emmy whispered, her voice noticeably weaker than it had been 2 weeks earlier. "Why the mournful face? It's just a minor setback. You know how dramatic I am." Sophia approached the bed, trying to smile through the tears that threatened to turn into uncontrollable sobs. "Sure, just a setback. Nothing we can't handle together, as always." "Who is he?" Emmy asked, noticing Alexander standing near the door, clearly trying to give them space, but not wanting to leave completely. It's Alexander. My boss," Sophia explained, unsure how to define exactly what he was to her now. Alexander approached slowly, as if he didn't want to invade an intimate moment, but also didn't want Sophia to feel alone. "Nice to meet you, Emmy. Sophia's told me a lot about you. She says you want to be a doctor." "Really?" Emmy smiled weakly, but Sophia could see the deep weariness in her eyes. "Did she tell you I want to specialize in pediatric oncology? I want to help other children like me. I want to be the doctor who brings good news to families. I think you'll be extraordinary at it. You have the perfect heart for it." For the next 6 hours, Alexander didn't leave the hospital. He brought coffee that no one drank, spoke to doctors in a tone Sophia had never heard before, and in a moment Sophia didn't see, had an intense private conversation with Dr. Martinez that resulted in Emmy being immediately transferred to the special care unit with a completely new medical team. "What did you do?" Sophia asked when they were alone in the hallway, Emmy finally asleep after hours of tests and treatments. "I brought Dr. Harrison from Boston. He's the best specialist in this type of relapse in the entire country. He'll be here early tomorrow." "Alexander, that must cost a fortune." "Let's not talk about money," he interrupted firmly. "Let's talk about doing everything in our power to give Emmy the best possible opportunity." Sophia looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Something that felt dangerously like complete, unconditional love. 5 days later, Emmy was stable, but would need aggressive experimental treatment for the next 8 months. Dr. Harrison had been clear. It was risky, but it was her best option. Sophia had practically lived in the hospital, sleeping in a reclining chair next to her sister's bed, refusing to leave even to shower. "You have to go home," Emmy insisted during one of her best afternoons. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Because you haven't. I'm not going to leave you alone. Not after what happened." "I won't be alone." Nurse David is teaching me how to play poker, and Mrs. Peterson in the next room is telling me stories about her time in Italy. Plus, that handsome boss of yours has turned my room into a flower shop." Sophia looked around the room, which did indeed look like a garden. Alexander had been sending flowers daily, along with books, magazines, a new iPad, and yesterday he had arrived with a giant teddy bear that took up an entire corner. "Emmy, about Alexander. Are you in love with him?" Emmy asked directly, with the brutal honesty that only a younger sister can muster. Sophia felt her cheeks heat up. It's complicated." "It's not complicated, Soph. You either love him or you don't. And from the way you light up when he arrives, and the way he looks at you like you're the most precious thing in the world, I'd say you're both completely head over heels for each other." "I'm scared," Sophia admitted. "I'm scared of being happy when you're struggling. I'm scared that if I allow myself to love him, something terrible will happen." Emmy held her sister's hand tighter than she had in days. "Soph, I've been sick for 2 years. 2 years during which you've completely put your life on hold. You haven't dated anyone. You've done nothing for yourself. If you don't allow yourself to be happy now, when someone who obviously adores you finally appears, then all my suffering will have been for nothing." Tears began to fall down Sophia's cheeks. "What if I lose you? What if you don't lose me? What if I survive, and you live the rest of your life regretting letting true love slip away out of fear? Go home, take a shower, and call that man who's been pacing these halls like a caged lion since we got here." That night, Sophia finally returned to her apartment, which now felt strange and empty without Emmy's constant presence. She took a shower for the first time in days, put on clean clothes, and was considering how she was going to handle her situation with Alexander when the doorbell rang. Alexander was standing in her doorway, with bags of what was obviously homemade food, and a worried expression he hadn't tried to hide. "I thought you might be hungry," he said simply, "and I thought you shouldn't be alone tonight. You didn't have to come." "Sophia," he interrupted, and there was something in his voice that made her immediately shut up. "Let me in, please." She stepped aside, and Alexander went straight into the kitchen as if he'd been there 1,000 times. He began pulling out containers of food that smelled incredibly good. Homemade lasagna, fresh salad, bread that was still warm. "Did you cook this?" Sophia asked, genuinely surprised. "Maria, my housekeeper, has strict instructions to keep my freezer stocked with real food for emergencies." "I thought this qualified as an emergency," she explained, serving generous portions onto plates she'd brought from her own kitchen. They ate in silence for a while, and Sophia realized it was the first real meal she'd had in days. Alexander watched her carefully, as if cataloguing every bite she took, making sure she was really eating. "Thank you," he finally said. "Not just for the food, for everything. For staying at the hospital, for bringing Dr. Harrison, for just being there. No one else would have. Yes, I have to thank you." Alexander put down his fork and looked directly at her with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight into her soul. "Sophia, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you weeks ago." The serious tone of his voice immediately put her on alert. "That? I've been paying all of Emmy's medical expenses since the first week you worked for me." Sophia froze completely, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "That? I spoke with the hospital, arranged for everything to be sent directly to my accounting office. The treatments, the specialist consultations, the experimental medications, everything." "Alexander, I can't. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars." "That's too much." "It's not much," he interrupted firmly. "And it's not charity. It's investment." "Investment in what?" Alexander stood up and walked to the window, his hands in his pockets, clearly struggling for the right words. When he turned around, there was something completely vulnerable in his expression that Sophia had never seen before. "In you, in us, in whatever this is becoming, because it's something I've never experienced before." Sophia felt her heart race so fast she was sure he could hear it. "Alexander, my sister Isabella died of leukemia when she was 17, he said abruptly, the words coming out as if he'd been botching them up for years. "I was 30, just starting my own business, and I thought I could fix everything with money. I hired the best doctors in the world, took her to the best clinics in Europe. Spent every penny I had and some I didn't, but it wasn't enough. He stopped, breathing deeply as if the words cost him a physical effort. She died in my arms in a hospital in Switzerland, and her last words were an apology for costing so much money. A 17-year-old girl died apologizing for the cost of keeping her alive. Sophia felt tears running down her cheeks at the sight of Alexander, younger and broken, holding his dying sister. When I met you, when you told me about Emmy, it was like the universe gave me a second chance. I can't save Isabella, but maybe I can help save Emmy. Maybe I can make sure she never has to apologize for wanting to live. Sophia stood up slowly, approaching him with careful steps. Is that why you hired me? Out of pity? Out of guilt for your sister? No, he replied immediately, taking her hands with a firmness that belied the vulnerability in his voice. I hired you because in 30 seconds I saw a woman struggle, sacrifice, love unconditionally, and I realized I'd gone 40 years without knowing a real woman. She moved closer, until she could feel the warmth of his body and the scent of his cologne mixing with something uniquely his. I hired you because you're brilliant, hard-working, because from the moment you walked into my office, my world became brighter. And I'm falling in love with you, Sophia Carter. I'm falling in love with your strength, your dedication, the way you light up every room you walk into, the way you love your sister with all your being. The words hung in the air between them like a sacred confession that fundamentally shifted the energy in the room. Sophia felt her entire world reorganize around this declaration. Me too, she murmured, her voice filled with an emotion she'd been trying to suppress for weeks. I'm falling in love with you too. I fell in love with your hidden gentleness, the way you treat Emmy like she's precious, the way you make me feel safe for the first time in years. This time, when they kissed, it was different from all their previous kisses. There wasn't the tentative desperation of the first kiss, but something deeper, more promising. Alexander took her in his arms, as if she were something infinitely precious, and Sophia allowed herself to melt against him, feeling all the barriers she had built around her heart finally crumble. Stay with me tonight, he whispered against her lips. I don't want to be alone. I don't want to wake up without you here. Alexander looked into her eyes, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation. Are you sure? I don't want to pressure you when you're vulnerable. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she replied, and there was a conviction in her voice that convinced him completely. He took her to her room, and under the soft light of the bedside lamp that had belonged to her parents, Alexander showed her with infinitely tender caresses and kisses that seemed to promise eternity how precious she was to him. Every touch was a silent promise, every whisper a declaration of love that neither of them had expected to find amidst so much pain. When they finally gave themselves to each other, it was with a passion that completely transcended the physical. It was the union of two souls who had found in each other the peace they didn't know they were missing, the home they had been searching for without even knowing they were. Later, as Sophia rested in his arms, Alexander stroked her hair gently, memorizing the feeling of having her completely his. What are you thinking about? She murmured, her voice sleepy and content. That I want to wake up like this every day for the rest of my life. That I want Emmy to get better so I can walk you down the aisle without you feeling guilty about being happy. Sophia sat up slightly to look at him, surprised by the direction of his thoughts. Are you sure what you're saying? I'm not exactly the type of woman you normally date. I'm not rich. I don't have social connections. I have enormous responsibilities. That's exactly why I love you, he smiled, caressing her cheek. I don't want normal, Sophia. I don't want easy. I want you. Your strength, your responsibilities, your sister, the whole package. I want to be part of your family. It'll be complicated. Emmy is going to need a lot of care for the next few months, maybe years. Then we'll take care of her together, he interrupted without hesitation. I've been thinking, my penthouse has 4 bedrooms. Emmy could have her own, overlooking the park. It would be closer to the hospital, and you wouldn't have to worry about rent or expenses while she's receiving treatment. Sophia looked at him in complete amazement. Are you asking us to move in with you? I'm asking to be part of your family, he said with a seriousness that moved her to tears. I'm asking for the chance to prove that not all rich men are emotionally useless. I'm asking that you allow me to love you the way you deserve to be loved." Sophia laughed through the tears she didn't know had started to fall. "Alexander Stone, I think you are the most extraordinary man I have ever met. Is that a yes?" "It's a yes to everything. To moving in with you, to building something beautiful together, to seeing how far this crazy love can take us." Alexander kissed her deeply, and in that kiss were promises of shared mornings, of battles faced as a team, and of a love that had grown in the most unexpected ways amidst the most difficult circumstances. 2 months later, Emmy sat on the terrace of Alexander's penthouse, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, a radiant smile gradually returning to her face. Her second course of experimental treatment was over, and although she was still thin and sometimes tired easily, the doctors were genuinely optimistic for the first time in years. "I can't believe this is our home now," she said, looking out at Central Park, which stretched out before them like a tapestry of green and gold. "It's like living in a fairy tale, except this Prince Charming makes amazing pancakes on Sundays." Sophia sat down next to him, holding his hand, which already felt stronger than it had been weeks before. "Are you really happy here, Emmy? Don't you miss our apartment?" "Are you kidding?" "I have my own room with a bathroom bigger than our old kitchen, a jacuzzi, a park view, and the richest man in New York who asks me every morning what I want for breakfast. Plus, he's helping me with advanced math. Did you know he's a genius at calculus? And what do you think of Alexander?" Honestly, Emmy smiled with the mischief she had maintained even during her worst days. "I think he's completely, desperately, irrevocably in love with you. And I think you're in the same state. And I think after everything we've been through, we deserve a little crazy, complicated happiness." Alexander appeared on the terrace with a tray of hot chocolate topped with marshmallows and whipped cream, and Sophia felt her heart skip a beat the way it always did when she saw him, as if her body would never fully adjust to the miracle of having him in her life. "Am I interrupting a sisterly conversation?" she asked, distributing the steaming cups. "I was just telling Sophia that I completely approve of this relationship," Emmy announced authoritatively. "You officially have my blessing to fall head over heels for my older sister." Alexander laughed, a genuine free laugh that Sophia had learned to love more than any sound in the world. "Too late for that, Emmy. I'm already madly in love. He's been a lost cause from day one." As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the three sat together on the terrace, and Sophia realized that for the first time in years, she felt completely at peace. Not only had she found true love, she had found a family. And Emmy, her invincible little warrior, was fighting and winning once again. Alexander took Sophia's hand, interlacing their fingers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. And in that simple touch was the promise of a future they had built together, against all odds, through pain, and toward something beautiful. Where are you listening from? Comment below if you believe in second chances and happy endings that are built day by day.